My son is 3. He just a few months ago got his first haircut. And we had heard horror stories from other parents about how this was going to go. That we heard stories of tears and tantrums. And I sort of get it, right? You're in a strange new place and there are sharp scissors near your head, and suddenly you look completely different than you did when you walked in.
Yeah.
And so what we tried to do is like think as Fred would think, how do we make this familiar before we go off to this mysterious and maybe scary
Mm.
place? And so we sat down and we watched the full episode of Fred getting a haircut. There's an episode for the neighborhood for everything. Whatever it is your child's about to encounter, you can go find Fred talking about it.
Hi, I'm Crystal Luce, professor of education.
And I'm Aimee Ketchum, pediatric occupational therapist.
Welcome to Plant the Seed of Learning, the podcast where we merge education and medical models to bring you science-based practical insights on all things early childhood.
Whether you're a parent, teacher, therapist, or policymaker, we're here to help you support children from the start. So, we are very excited for our guest today. Today, we have with us Ryan Rydzewski. He's an award-winning writer and speaker. I hope I pronounced your name right.
You
A
got as close as most people get.
Okay, good, 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 good. He's a former teacher. His magazine stories focus on everything from schools to space travel to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And he's the co-author of the nationally best-selling book, When You Wonder, You're Learning, Mr. Rogers' Enduring Lessons for Raising Creative, Curious, Caring Kids. His next book explores human fulfillment, the weird and wonderful ways we pursue it, share it, and create the conditions for others to find it too. So, welcome, Ryan. We are so happy to have you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm a huge fan of your book and of the work that both of you are doing. It's an honor.
Oh, well, right. Yeah, right back at you. We are fans of you and your book and all the amazing work you do as well. You submitted a very humble bio. I think that could have gone on for about an hour if we
Yeah.
covered all of your accolades. So, really great to have you. We had the opportunity to meet at a couple of different conferences. So, we're really happy to get to dig into the book you wrote and with Greg and all things Mr. Rogers and also
Sure.
your new book. Yeah. So let's jump right in. Can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to write When You Wonder You're Learning and about that process a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, the story starts about a decade ago. I am sitting right now in the offices of the Grable Foundation, which is a family philanthropy based here in Pittsburgh that supports all sorts of places where kids and families learn. So, schools, museums, libraries, you name it. And part of the privilege and the responsibility of providing that support is to do it as responsibly as you can, right? And so, with Greg Bear, who's my co-author of the book, he's also the executive director here. We really started digging into the learning sciences. What are we learning about learning itself and how great learning happens? What are the methods and the conditions that are most conducive to great learning? And I remember at the outset, I thought, when we get into this, it's going to be charts and graphs and lots of technical terminology that I'm not going to quite understand, really in the weeds, sort of pedagogy type stuff. And what we found was the opposite. These scientists, these world-class scientists at places like Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh, but also further afield, Stanford, MIT, you name it, when they talked about how great learning happens, they were asking questions. Questions like, how do we make sure kids feel safe?
Yeah.
Mm.
How do we make sure kids belong to a community that cares about them? And how do we make them feel, as Fred Rogers used to say, that they are loved and capable of loving? And what we realized over time is that if you read enough of these research papers coming out of world-class universities, they start to read a little bit like scripts from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. They're asking those same questions that Fred Rogers asked as he created Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood right here in Pittsburgh almost 50 years ago. And that was our sort of light bulb moment because at the time, Fred Rogers was coming roaring back into the culture. There was the Tom Hanks movie where Tom Hanks played Fred in a movie called Won't You Be My Neighbor? Oh, no, I'm sorry. It was called A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. There was a documentary by Morgan Neville called Won't You Be My Neighbor, which is just fantastic. There was a new biography of Fred that had just come out. And so people were thinking about Fred Rogers, the man, the person, right, who is absolutely worthy of our attention. But Greg and I realized, well, maybe there's also an additional story to be told about Fred, one that's been overlooked. The story of Fred Rogers, the learning scientist, someone from whom we can continue to learn from today as we think about what does great learning look like in 2026 and beyond.
Yes, he was a scientist. Could
He
see it
was.
embedded in every show.
Absolutely. It was
Oh,
seamless. Yeah.
yes.
It was so natural the way he infused learning. You just
Right.
sat
And
you
if you
got
don't
sucked
know the
in.
learning science, you would never even know it's there. And
No.
then once you start to dig into it, you see it in everything. And, from the
Yes.
songs he wrote to even the wardrobe he put on, there was a thoughtfulness
Colored.
and intention behind every little detail. And I'll be honest, part of the concern at the outset of this project was, well, if we dig, if we open up the hood and figure out how Fred did what he did, are we going to ruin the magic, right? Nobody wants to spoil the
Hmm.
warm memories we have of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. But we found that for us, the effect was the opposite. To understand the level of deliberate intention that
Hmm.
Fred was able to sustain over the course of 4 decades, almost 1,000 episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, thinking about little details down to, is it going to be little or big this week or big or little? The fact that he
Hmm.
thought about all those little things for so long because he knew it was what was best for kids,
Yep.
he only rose in our estimation, as if Mr. Rogers could be admired anymore. He was a workhorse, he was brilliant, and his work is, still accessible to all of us today.
Love's in
That's
the
yeah.
details. Yeah.
That's the
And
most amazing part about Mr. Rogers is that it stands the test of time, the way
Yes.
he engaged with his audience.
And weirdly, it stands the test of time despite having not changed all that much over the course that, the color of the room changed and it went from black and white to color TV. But you think about what television looked like in 1969 versus what it looks like today. Mr. Rogers didn't change all that much. He was his authentic self. And you're right, it stood the test of time. It still does.
Yeah. I would say the same about your book. It is so beautifully written.
Oh,
And
thank you.
I go back to it and read parts of it frequently because I teach a lot of grad classes, and
Mm.
there's so much in there that I can use with my students. But you did a great job unearthing research and probably connecting it to the learning sciences. Can you tell us a little bit about how you went about the research process as you were writing your book?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that. That means a lot to hear.
Yeah.
But the first thing we did when we had this idea was call Joanne Rogers because our I guess sort of innate fear was how do you presume to write a book about one of the most beloved people on the planet, right? And to try to tell a new story about that person. And so we turned to Joanne and said, first of all, does this idea sound right to you? Fred Rogers, the learning scientist. And if so, would you be supportive of us doing this book? And the answer was a resounding, enthusiastic yes to both of those questions, which meant so much to both of us to have that sort of official blessing from Queen Sarah Saturday. Um,
Mhm.
and so we started asking, first of all, um, talking to some of the people who worked with Fred, many of whom are still working in Pittsburgh today, doing incredible work in their own right,
mhm.
advising on things like Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, um, and then digging into the archives. So at the Fred Rogers Institute, which is based at St. Vincent College in Latrobe,
Yes.
Pennsylvania, where Fred was born,
Mhm.
um, they have boxes and boxes and boxes of everything you could imagine related to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. His scripts, his handwritten notes, letters that were written to him from
Mhm.
students and from parents and from caregivers, bringing their concerns to him. And you can see Fred's handwritten notes in the margin, thinking about how he's going to respond. And we really started to see the neighborhood as a conversation between Fred and his listeners. You can draw a direct through line almost between what was on his viewers' minds and then what Fred was then talking about in the neighborhood.
Mm.
And then what we try to do is connect, well, okay, how does that work reflect what we know about learning and child development today? And so we started talking to modern learning scientists as well. And the more we did that, the more we realized just how ahead of his time Fred was. I mean, often we're learning things about learning that we couldn't confirm with science until 10 years after Fred's death, right? And yet there was something about him that innately understood what kids needed to learn and grow. And he studied a lot himself. I mean, he was a scholar. He worked with some of the leading pediatricians and psychologists and psychiatrists in the world, all of whom happened to be working in Pittsburgh at the exact same time back in the late 1950s. This incredible triumvirate of Dr. Benjamin Spock and Eric Erickson and his mentor,
Yeah.
Margaret McFarland, one of the greatest child development psychologists of all time. All these folks were advising Fred, and he was learning from them about what children need in order to learn, grow, and develop. And he was blending what he was learning from them with his original songs and with his stories and his puppetry, building this thing that became this neighborhood that so many of us grew up in and still remember so fondly today.
Mhm.
Ugh, such good stuff. I think I read somewhere that sometimes if an episode wasn't working, he would literally stop in the middle of the episode and like go out and meet with Dr. Spock and like have a little consultation on how can we do this better? Which
Absolutely. Yeah. So the child care center that Fred worked in and studied in was called the Arsenal Family and Children's Center, founded by Dr. Benjamin Spock,
yes.
co-founded by Eric Erickson and Dr. Margaret McFarland. And Dr. McFarland worked at Pitt, which is, it's about 2 blocks from WQED, where Fred was creating the neighborhood. And so,
Oh.
yes, if he would hit a snag, or if he wasn't quite sure if something was right, he would just walk out the door and go up the street and have a chat with his mentor, which creates a sort of charming story today. His
Yeah.
staff, I don't think, found it super charming to have their host
Right.
suddenly disappear. And it was
Yeah.
extraordinarily expensive to stop production.
Sure.
But Fred
Yeah.
was willing to do that. He was willing to take that hit to cover those expenses because, as he used to say, I wanted to give the best I could.
Yeah.
And he knew if giving the best he could meant, all right, we're going to stop for a little while and I'm going to go talk to the people who know the right answer, that's what he would go do.
Yeah.
And there's this story about Fred. I think he was perhaps in India. He was asked to go all over the world to help advise on other children's programs. And they ran into a similar situation where they weren't sure if it was supposed to be big and little or big, or something like that. Some
Mhm.
some detail that to most of us would seem insignificant. And
Uh-huh.
at some point, Fred said, or somebody said to Fred, you know, it's a kid's show. Let's just pick something and move on. Why does it
Oh.
matter? And Fred said, that's exactly why it matters. It has to matter because this is for our youngest learners.
Oh.
And it was that commitment to excellence and attention to detail that really sets his work apart.
Yeah. And that's why it still resonates today.
Hmm.
Oh, amazing. So I had the honor of going out to Latrobe and meeting Roberta Schoenberg when she was there.
Mm.
She let me sit in Fred's chair that Tom Hanks used in the movie. It was a thrill of a lifetime for me. So tell us a little bit more about the people that you got to meet through this experience that knew Mr. Rogers and what they say about him, what they told you. Any little
Yeah,
nuggets?
so absolutely. To a person, what we hear again and again is that Fred, the Fred you saw on the street walking around Pittsburgh, was the same Fred you saw on television.
Mm,
The Fred we saw on screen was not an act, it was just him.
yeah.
And so we have all sorts of stories of Fred. People would see him at the pharmacy or they would see him at a restaurant. We actually met one person who actually hit Fred with her car when he was crossing an intersection. It was a minor accident, and he was very nice about it.
Oh my
But he
God.
was just a person walking around like you or I, and,
Wow.
and that's something that Joanne reminded us as we started this project.
Yeah.
That like Fred Rogers wasn't a saint.
Hmm.
He had a method to what he did. He was an extraordinarily hard worker. He
Hmm.
was an extraordinarily brilliant scholar. But what he did, all of us can do some version of that. And it was sort of nice to be reminded of that Fred was a mortal just like all of us, because it can be sort of tempting to throw up your hands and say, well, I could never be as good as Fred Rogers. But the fact
Right.
is, all of us can in our own way do that. So that's the first thing we heard just from folks who knew him, or ran into him around town. But from some of the folks who worked with him very closely, they always talk about the first thing they bring up is how funny he was. He was really fun to work with. He
Mhm.
loved jokes. He loved to make sure that his crew and his colleagues were having a good time. And I think you can see some of that joy reflected in the neighborhood. I think it comes through on tape. And then we also see folks continuing his legacy in such a way that it's sometimes hard to tell where Fred ends and his colleagues begin because they are so Fred-like themselves. Someone who comes to mind, who the two of you may know, is Hedda Sherapan. So Hedda is a legendary early childhood educator in her own right. And she was a producer. She worked with Fred from the very first day of production back in the late 1960s, even before Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood went national. She was with Fred from the beginning to the end, and she's still doing incredible work today. And what makes this so meaningful for me is that, I have two kids of my own now, and Hedda, she knits them sweaters and she makes them blankets
Oh,
and she brings over little Daniel Tiger gifts.
Oh
And
my
so it's just so meaningful to me that this program that meant so much to me growing up and helped me become who I am. The people who made that program are now taking care of my own children. It's a
God.
reminder that all of this stuff is real and it can be real for all of us if we commit to caring for kids in the way that Fred committed.
Oh,
oh,
beautiful.
that is beautiful. And speaking of, Fred and how much he cared for kids, I've heard you talk about how he had this blueprint for life that amazing. And you talking about being a parent, and I'm a parent of four kids, and Aimee has two kids. How does that resonate with you, this blueprint for life as a parent? And what about other parents? What should they learn from this?
Yeah, I have to credit Joanne for that metaphor, that blueprint, because I think we often think, at least before this project, I had just thought of the neighborhood as this pleasant memory in my mind, right? This place that I sort of grew up in, that I remember watching all the time as a kid, but that's all it was just this sort of pleasant thing that I got to experience, that I was lucky enough to experience as a child of my own. What Joanne meant when she talked about the blueprint was there's something here that we can use to build for children of our own, that we can use to build a sort of modern day neighborhood um, for 2026 and beyond. And I've really come to think of, I can just give you a personal example of how it works for me and for my family. My son is 3. He just a few months ago got his first haircut. And we had heard horror stories from other parents about how this was going to go. That we heard stories of tears and tantrums. And I sort of get it, right? You're in a strange new place and there are sharp scissors near your head, and suddenly you look completely different than you did when you walked in.
Yeah.
And so what we tried to do is like think as Fred would think, how do we make this familiar before we go off to this mysterious and maybe scary
Mm.
place? And so we sat down and we watched the full episode of Fred getting a haircut. There's an episode for the neighborhood for everything. Whatever it is your child's about to encounter, you can go find Fred talking about it in almost 900 of these episodes. And so we watched Fred get a haircut. And the first thing that blew me away is that my son, then, just over 2, sat through a 28-minute episode of something. He really exceeded my expectations. He was engrossed in this black and white, slow-moving television program. Normally, he's watching cartoons. There's something about the neighborhood that kids just find irresistible.
Yep.
And so we watched Fred get a haircut, and then we went to the barber shop ourselves. And my son strolled in with a smile on his face. They put the smock on, and he smiled all through his haircut, and he kept saying again and again, "I'm just like Mr. Rogers." And
Oh,
I actually filmed this and I sent it to Hedda Sherapan, who I mentioned earlier, so that she can
Yeah.
see that this program that she helped to build is still helping kids today.
wow.
So when I think about that blueprint, I can think of Fred's work as a tool, something that can be useful today, something I can use to build a more supportive and welcoming and hopefully joyful environment for my kids, um, learning from what Fred did and for what he built for me.
That makes so much sense because once kids see the familiarity in something and they connect it to their own lives, it makes it all the more easier for them when they go to do it themselves. I love that.
Exactly. And that's why when Fred came to your part of the state to help us visit the Crayola factory and see how people made crayons, we started that episode just like we started every episode. We started in Fred's living room, and he would come in and he sat down and he just pulled out that box of crayons and he started to draw, just like any kid would draw.
Yeah.
He didn't start by plopping us down in an unfamiliar factory. He knew kids needed some sort of grounding in what is familiar before we can go off and do something new, before they can be curious about something that they haven't yet experienced. Um, and so it's again and again in my daily life, I'm always coming back to those lessons and that blueprint that Fred left for us. Because again and again, I'm finding that it works in my own life.
Those are
Yeah.
such great examples and really great tips for our listeners of things we can all do today. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that because one of the arguments we sort of had with our publisher is we didn't want to write parenting for dummies because
Mhm.
Greg and I don't hold ourselves up as experts in any of this. Like we're just two dads, right? Two regular dads of our respective families. And the publisher said again and again, well, you got to have something in here that's practical. We need practical tips for readers.
Uh-huh.
And we finally said, okay, we'll do that, but only if we source these practical tips from the real experts, from the Hedda Sharapins of the world. And so that's what we did. As we did the interviews for this book with learning scientists and with folks who worked with Fred, we asked them, like, well, what are your tips? What has worked in your own life? And we've tried to collect those in the book and share them with readers. So they don't necessarily come from us, they come from the people that we are still learning from. And that's been really, really helpful for me. And we always hear from readers. We're always humbled to hear from readers that that's their favorite section. Those are their favorite sections of the book. So our publisher
Sure.
was really right all along.
That's great. Yeah. Everybody loves practical tips. That's
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's what we want to do. We want to turn the science into practice. So
Yes.
love it.
Yes.
Very true.
So, speaking of that, I'm thinking about parents trying to provide, that good, strong foundation for children as their first teachers or teachers themselves, early childhood educators. But, we have early learning standards that have to be met, benchmarks, but we still want to protect that space for wonder and encourage that early curiosity, which Crystal and I often talk about the importance of play.
Mm.
How, in your experience of, and all about from what you've learned writing the book, how would you suggest parents and teachers do that? How do we balance hitting the benchmarks, but also protecting time for play, curiosity, and wonder?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's clearly on the minds of just about every educator that we come across. Greg and I are fortunate in that we travel to schools and conferences all over the country to talk about Fred and his work, and that's probably the most common question we get.
Okay.
And having been a former teacher, I totally get it because there are a million things you have to do at any given moment. How do you also make space for wonder and stillness and depth and all the other things that Fred made space for in the neighborhood?
Mhm.
And one of the things that is, I've always found it helpful is that nothing Fred did in the neighborhood is sort of a grand sweeping gesture. Everything he did was really little. Fred was very intentional about how he used little moments, about how he used in between moments. And he did those in some really interesting and creative ways. I'll give you just one example. Sometimes he just used the environment. So you'll notice if you watch the beginning of Mr. Rogers when they switched to color in the 1970s, that Fred's living room is blue. And Fred will come down and he'll in his blue living room, and sometimes he'll put on a blue sweater and he'll sit down on a blue couch and he'll put on blue canvas shoes. Now, it doesn't look like Fred's doing anything in those moments, but we now know from science that the color blue can be so calming to children that it can actually aid their creative thinking. Now, that's something that doesn't take any extra action in the moment, but it's just something he's strategically using the environment to drive behavior to drive children's mindsets. So that's one way. And we see educators using that idea of how do we make some little bets based in Fred's work to use those sort of small moments in a really powerful way. And one of my favorite studies we encountered in the book was a study that found, actually came from middle schools, that when middle school teachers greeted students at the classroom door with something as simple as a handshake or as quick as a hug, or by simply saying, I'm really glad you're here today, disruptions dropped by 9%, engagement went up by 20%. That simple act of greeting students as they came in
Mm,
effectively added an extra hour of learning to the school day.
Oh my
mhm.
And
gosh.
this is
Yeah.
one of those studies that, if you're a scientist, might sound a little too good to be true, right? Science is never that clean.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened with this study. A bunch of scientists said, no way. And so they replicated the experiment. They ran it again. I think they tripled the sample size.
Okay.
And what they found was the effect was even more powerful than the original study had suggested. And so much of Fred did was about creating an environment. He called it an atmosphere. What are the little things we can do to create an atmosphere that's conducive to all those other things that we have to do, but still gives us the time and space to breathe and to relate to one another, and to wonder about things that we're curious about. I'll tell you the the thing that stuck with me the most, and this happened before I even wrote the book with Greg, and it stuck with me all these years. And it wasn't until after the book came out that I realized the importance of what this person told me. When I was a teacher, I was a teacher for a few years, and then I became an educator coach. And so my job was to coach new teachers all over the state of Louisiana, where I was living at the time. So I drove from school to school. It was a great job. I got to go see lots of different teachers, lots of different districts, lots of different buildings. And so many of these places were more or less the same, right? The schools were all built in the same era. They had the same sort of mix of new and experienced teachers, same student demographics for the most part. But there was one school that was completely different. And I couldn't put my finger on why, because if you looked at it, it looked the same as the others, same mix of teachers, but you just felt good walking in there. You could tell the teachers were happy to be there. You could tell the students were happy to be there. The atmosphere was just completely different. And finally, one day I went to the principal and I said, I need you to tell me what you're doing differently than your peers, because the teachers that I'm here to support are so much happier and so much more effective than the teachers at other schools. And the principal laughed because right away she knew what I was talking about. And she said, look, at the beginning of every year, we take 2 weeks and we don't teach any content. And she said, I get flack every year because I'm taking these 2 weeks just to get to know students and to let students get to know us. And I get yelled at by my superintendent and my school board and my fellow principals, sometimes even parents, for not jumping straight into content. And then she said, and every single year, we outperform all the people who are telling me not to do this.
Wow.
And it was an illustration in retrospect of the importance of creating that atmosphere of relationships,
Mm,
of depth, of wonder. Sometimes if we do those things on the front end, they are conducive to all the million, standards we have to hit for the rest of the year. They can actually support us in doing so. So there's no easy answer. But if we can do little things here and there to contribute to that atmosphere,
uh-huh.
those little things turn out often to not be so little at all.
Mm.
I love that. I'm salivating as you're
Yeah.
talking. So many examples are running in my head.
Yeah.
Specifically, I'm teaching a grad course right now, and it's on case studies. So my students run little case studies. And
Mm.
so you mentioned greeting students at the door, and that study led to so much more interaction and engagement. One of my students did a case study on morning meetings and
Okay.
engagement during math, because she was finding sometimes students in, it was a fourth grade, don't participate as much in math as she wanted. And she wanted to see if there's any connection. So she did all of these engaging activities in the morning meeting and then segued into math. And when she did these morning meetings with more engagements, more interaction, more dialogue, the students participated more in math class. And
Oh,
I
I
just,
love that. I love
Isn't
that.
it
Yeah,
so
that
good?
atmosphere, it was an atmosphere for
Yeah,
learning. Absolutely. And,
exactly.
we've seen
Relationships.
schools, yes, and we've seen schools literally roll out red carpets, put red carpets down the hallway just to signal that, like, hey, you're really special to us. We're really
Yeah.
happy you're the celebrities of this school.
Yeah.
We've seen, there's a district not far from Pittsburgh. This is one of my favorites that, they have, like many schools have, this sort of intervention period, 40 minutes every single day that is sometimes used to great effect, but not always, right? Sometimes, kids use it as a study hall. Sometimes they use it for homework help. Sometimes they didn't use it much for anything.
Hmm.
And so the school district said, how can we use this sort of in between time more intentionally and more deliberately? And it started with just a Google Doc. All the teachers in this district, they opened a Google Doc and they just wrote in all the things that they were good at and that they would like to teach. And these weren't necessarily related to content, right? One teacher might be able to teach kids how to change a tire. Or the school secretary, because this included the whole staff, the school secretary might be able to teach kids how to sew. And so every single day in this school district, kids get to take some sort of mini course from a student who, or from a teacher who may or may not have for content. Maybe they're working with the janitor or they're working with a teacher in another grade, not only to learn how to just do stuff, which again, Fred showed us the importance of sampling in the neighborhood. We were always doing new things, but to build relationships with adults who they might not otherwise encounter or have opportunity or chances to interact with over the course of the school day. And that creates that atmosphere for learning that then supports all the other subjects that they have to learn across the course of a day or year.
That is so important. And you really talk about school-wide initiatives and things
Mhm.
that schools can do to foster curiosity. I want to continue with that and thinking about schools, if we would design schools that foster curiosity rather than compliance, what would they look like?
Oh, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. Um, I think that curiosity, it would have to start with the adults. What I would love to see, and what we are increasingly seeing as we visit schools across the country, is how do we give teachers space and opportunity, and sometimes it's just a matter of giving them permission to bring something that lights them up into the school day. And maybe that thing is related to content, or maybe it isn't.
Mhm.
One of my favorite examples comes from actually Wheeling, West Virginia. There was a teacher there named Luke Hallidick at Wheeling Country Day School. And Luke really, really loved filmmaking. And yet he was a fifth grade science teacher. And he thought, well, how do I bring this love of filmmaking into a fifth grade science class? And with his students, he came up with this brilliant project in which they were going to attach his filmmaking equipment to a weather balloon and then send that weather balloon up into the air to get some cool, photos from the air of the school's campus. And you can imagine all the things kids would have to learn in order to pull this off, right? They ended up having to learn about wind velocity and weight and lift and all these standards that they did have to hit.
Mhm.
But this project was so exciting to them. And it was came from such a place of curiosity because even the teacher himself, Luke, didn't know if this was going to work. They went into it just not knowing. And, there's a great quote in our book from the educator Melissa Butler who says, learning is keeping yourself in a perpetual state of not knowing. This project was so impactful that they did it year in and year out. They actually ended up doing 10 years in a row. And on the 10th anniversary launch, the original class, the class that did that first balloon launch, they all came back to Wheeling. These kids were in college now. They all traveled back to see their fifth grade science teacher and help the current fifth graders launch their own balloon. One of the students said, this project ruined school for me. And what she meant by that was it was so good that nothing else ever matched it. It was
Mhm.
so, and I think that really came from letting a teacher do something that he was genuinely excited and lit up by. And, kids catch on, regardless of whether they go on to do anything related to science or weather balloons in their adult lives. They got to learn from a teacher who was genuinely lit up by the things that he was able to bring in the classroom. And Fred used to say that the best teacher in the world is the one who loves what he or she loves and just loves it in front of you. So, to foster curiosity over compliance, I feel like we need to let teachers love what they love and love it in front of kids, even if there might not be an immediate connection to a standard or to a standardized test.
Oh, I love that example.
And it makes for happier teachers, right? Because you get to
Yeah.
do things that you love.
And you never know what is going to trigger another student in the class, for their future. And you have these students coming back to the school because it meant so much to them. When I was a teacher, another colleague and I entered a NASA competition.
Oh, cool.
We did this with third grade students, and we had to create these STEM-based I don't know, toys, let's call them. But it required, we split our classes in half and they were designing these amazing creations, and then we had to send them to NASA, and NASA evaluated them. Well, my colleague won the competition. And
Wow.
so, we have students still talking about that today. What an amazing activity that was beyond the school day, but we accomplished everything that we would have standard based just through this activity.
Absolutely. Yeah, a student is never going to remember how good your lesson on fractions was. And it's not to say
No,
content isn't important. It is
it
really
is.
important. But
Right.
what students are going to remember is, how much joy and curiosity you yourself brought to the
Yeah.
classroom. And when you think
Yeah.
back, at least when I think back on all my favorite teachers over the years, none of them were my favorite because they were just absolute pedagogical rock stars. Some of them were, some of
Yeah.
them very much were not. But they
Right.
were my favorite because they made me happy to be there, and they made me happy to be there because they were clearly happy to be there too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Teachers should be designing rockets and blowing things up.
Yeah.
Whatever makes them happy. Exactly. They need the permission and the space to do that.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. You're giving them the permission and the space right now.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's great. So we have to ask this question in a world
Okay.
full of the distractions that we live in, of so many things, overscheduled children, screens, and now the emergence of even AI toys. How do we continue to protect this deep thinking and questioning in young children when there's so much stimulation?
Yeah. It's a great question. And the thing that jumps to mind and the thing that I'm still trying to protect and cultivate in my own life and in my kids' lives is Fred's appreciation for silence. And it's sort of amazing when you think about it, how off limits silence is on television.
Yeah.
Every moment of airtime, even today, probably costs thousands, if not millions of dollars. And Fred knew that quiet airtime was not necessarily wasted airtime. If you go back and you watch The Neighborhood, there are so many moments in which not much is happening. There's one episode where Fred and Mr. McFeely literally sit down and they have just painted their living room and they sit down and they watch paint dry. And I think that was Fred sending a very deliberate message to the adults who are watching
Mhm.
that stillness really, really matters.
Yeah.
And it's also ever more scarce, as you mentioned, in a world that's completely saturated by technology, some of which, can be really helpful. I don't think tech in and of itself is necessarily a bad thing, but it certainly is pervasive. It certainly is distracting, and it prevents us from ever getting bored, which is something that we know from science really, really matters. And in fact, Fred even used to sing about that, the importance of being bored, because that's where creativity and questions and curiosity all emerge. Um,
I would
so
love
we
for
need to
boredom to
protect
make
that
a
stillness.
comeback.
Yes,
Wouldn't
yeah.
that be
When I
great?
think about like the thing that mattered most from my own childhood,
Yeah.
it might be long summers with nothing to do.
Yes.
And I know not every kid gets that privilege. Not every kid, and
Wow.
it's not, summers aren't always a happy time for every kid.
Mhm.
But I feel like it's those summers that just as much as school helped make me who I am
Yeah.
because I had to develop that sense of self from
Hmm.
that boredom and from, we had months and months of limitless possibilities. What are you going to do with them? And I do worry that, kids aren't always confronted with those possibilities or with that freedom.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm trying to protect that for my own kids to a degree.
That's so true. When I think about my own childhood, I played in the woods all the
Yeah.
time. Just endless, who knows what was going to happen, but it was such an amazing time designing forts and who knows what else we did.
Yeah,
Pick up
absolutely.
rocks. When you think about today and the culture with early childhood, what would you protect at all costs, or what would you change?
Hmm. In addition to that unstructured time
Hmm.
and that freedom and permission to play, I would protect or encourage or support as much as I could um, a neighborhood to which every kid can turn. And I'll tell you what I mean by that, at least in my own life.
Yeah.
When I was growing up, it was a given that on every holiday or every I don't know, nice day in the summer, there were going to be people at my parents' house. My grandparents were going to be there. The neighbors would come over, the cousins. Like there was always just a community around me. And I didn't know any other way, right? I always had this neighborhood in my corner, people of every age and occupation and disposition to whom I could turn with anything in my life, whether it was a problem or whether I people to celebrate with, whatever it was. And I don't even think it necessarily has to be a family, right? But I think every kid needs that neighborhood, whatever that neighborhood looks like, in their corner. Um, Whether it's at a school or an out of school time program or your actual neighbor, wherever it is you happen to live. One of the people we spoke with to write this book was Dr. Valerie Kinlock, who was at the time the dean of the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh. And she told us about, just growing up in Charleston, South Carolina. And she said the moment that she fell in love with learning was when she realized that all the people around her, all the people on the front porches, all her neighbors, she called them a series of books that she realized she was able to read. And I feel like every kid deserves that library of books. Whoever, whoever those books are, whatever form they take. That community is so, so important. And again, we see that reflected from science again and again and again. So, how do we expose kids to as many caring adults as possible and give them that consistent care and support that they know they can rely on? When you look at the science of who goes on to thrive in their adult lives, I don't think there's anything more important. And we know that those communities are increasingly fractured, fractured by technology, fractured by distance, fractured by, just the strain of and expense and difficulty of life. It's really hard to provide those neighborhoods. And that's one of the reasons I really respect Fred for giving one to so many kids for so long and constantly reminding us of their importance.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the pace of the show. And I know when my daughter was about 4 and we started letting her watch some cartoons, she was really into like Dora the Explorer because she had, you'd see Dora merchandise everywhere and she loved that show. And I was worried about the overstimulation of
Mm.
that show, which there's far worse shows now, as far as, lots of stimulation and the quick transitions and so forth. And I really, one of the things I've always loved about Mr. Rogers is that very slow pace.
Yeah.
In fact, I can remember when I tried to very intentionally turn her on to like the old Peanuts shows and things that had a slower pace. And I remember her looking at Peanuts for a little while and watching Charlie Brown and Snoopy and saying to me, these kids are terrible actors because she was so used to the faster paced Dora the
Oh
Explorer,
my
which I
gosh.
thought was so funny, like through her eyes. But it just, it really makes me think about now everything you've said about Mr. Rogers' research, and obviously the pace of his show is extremely intentional. And I'm just curious what you think um, about some of these shows now, and even the AI generated
Mm.
programming that is available to children that often doesn't even really follow a plot line. It's just so much stimulation, fast moving, quick scene sequences versus that, slow
Hmm.
pace that we know is so much better for children's minds. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree. And my 3-year-old especially, we have YouTube kids, and I have to be so attentive to what pops up next because there's a lot of good quality children's programming. Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, I think, is fantastic. I personally love Bluey, but it is hard to find that sort of slow pace that we know matters, and frankly, that makes we're gonna have a much better night in our house if my kids watch something slow versus something fast. Um, but um, there's programming out there that you're right is just sort of slop. And it is starting to infiltrate more and more. It's starting to become more and more pervasive. And I do worry about that. Um, I understand the fear that some creators might have of doing something slow because most TV is not like that. And we talk all the time about shortening attention spans and the need to grab folks' attention and to keep it. And often the way people try to do that is with quick cuts and it's just very fragmented. Um, but I think Fred at least stands as proof that things don't have to be like that, that you can have a deep, slow, sometimes even silent program that's still completely enrapturing for young people. And the way Fred, I think, did that was through listening again. So if you go to you've been to the Fred Rogers Institute, Aimee, if you go to their archive, if any of your listeners have ever written letters to Fred Rogers, they can go to the archive and they can probably find their letter because they kept everything.
Oh,
In those boxes that I mentioned earlier are decades worth of correspondence from students and from parents and a surprising number of letters from people even in assisted living facilities just thanking Fred for being a presence in
Wow.
their lives. And knowing that Fred was responding to what children were deeply interested in and caring about. Some of the fears that they share with Fred will just break your heart, right? Mr. Rogers, my parents are getting divorced, or, somebody died, or somebody's sick. You can imagine the sorts of things people felt comfortable sharing with Fred. And the fact that he was able to address those head on without the distractions or the bells and whistles of a fast moving television program, it just stands as proof that that formula can work. And it does take some bravery, I think, to follow that blueprint. But I'm hopeful that if this book has done anything, it's to restore the neighborhood to the status I think it deserves. There's a building on the University of San Diego campus, their School of Education. It's this beautiful building, sort of overlooking the Pacific. And if you walk in, on the walls of this building, on the interior walls, are the names of the giants of 21st century education: Maria Montessori, John Dewey. And I really think the name Fred Rogers needs to be etched on those walls. It needs to be etched on all of our walls because we need to be reminded that what he did works, and we can learn from it and we can do some version of it ourselves.
So true. And we're here at the end of April right now, so we have 143 day coming up.
It is. It's coming up. Yeah.
I think May 4th, right?
It is
Something like
May
that.
23rd, unless it's
Oh, it's
a
May
leap year.
23rd.
But yeah, the 143rd
23rd.
day of the year. Yes.
Okay, yes.
that's
Yes. So
that's
yes,
great.
the 143. So it's the I love you that was his sort of trademark,
Yeah, it
143
was sort of his
fourth grade.
secret or like numerical code. There's one letter in
Yes.
I and four letters in love and three letters in you. And so a few years ago, this idea of 143 day really started taking root, first here in Pittsburgh and then in Pennsylvania, and now all over. In fact, Greg and I wrote a piece for Time arguing that this should be a national holiday, and I still believe that.
Yes.
But
Mm,
really, it's a
that's good.
reminder. It's a reminder that for more kindness, for sure, but really, it's a reminder for more neighborliness, and there's a difference.
Mhm.
Um, what we need to do, or what Fred was, I think, always reminding us to do, is to accept the people in our lives exactly as they are.
Mhm.
And that is harder than it sounds. I think
Yeah.
the headlines, will tell you all you need to know about how difficult that is.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But we know from science, again, when it comes to learning, when it comes to growing, when it comes to developing, that probably the number one predictor of whether or not we're going to thrive in our lives is whether someone accepts us just the way we are.
Wow.
And that's different from having someone tell us all the time that we're perfect or that everything we think and do is great or even okay.
Mm,
But it's just that constant reminder that all of us are worthy of the neighborhood we all share.
mm,
That for all of our joys and all of our failures and all of our fears and our whatever it is that we bring, we're all still worthy of one another. We're all still worthy of this neighborhood. And that is sort of what 143 Day stands for. And so, yeah, we look forward to that every year.
that's so great. What a great statement. The most impactful predictor of success is that someone accepts you just the way you are. I mean, you said it
Yeah.
more eloquently, but I just wanted to
Well,
repeat that.
I
It's true.
love that. And
Yeah, yeah.
there's this great little story of Fred in the late 1970s. He's invited by Hallmark, the greeting card company, to design Christmas display. So they had invited all these celebrities to design displays for their flagship store in Manhattan.
Oh,
And you can imagine what a Christmas display, in Manhattan looks like in the late 1970s. These things are really flashy and sort of over the top. All of them except for one. There's one display that is just it's a pine tree. It's about the height of a child, and it's encased in clear acrylic, so you can see the dirt and the roots. And on this little Christmas tree, there is no ornaments, there is no lights. It didn't even say who designed it. All the other celebrities had their names plastered all over these things. The only thing that was with this tree was a little plaque that said, "I like you just the way you are." And so you know who the designer of that
yeah.
display was. If
Yeah.
there was one message at the core of everything Fred did, it was that. It was that I like you just the way that you are, that I am not going to reject you
Mhm.
from this neighborhood.
I really like how you speak so fondly of neighborhoods. And, growing up in a neighborhood, I value that so much. And we live in a neighborhood. My kids grew up in a neighborhood. And so I just have one final thing I want to ask you.
Sure.
So thinking about neighborhoods and trying to protect and maintain that human interaction that is so needed and sometimes lacking today because of technology. You touched on it a little bit earlier. Technology keeps us inside instead of outside with our neighbors. So in the world of AI toys, how can we use the teachings of Mr. Rogers to protect children from AI and maintain that human interaction in our
Hmm.
neighborhood?
That's a great question. All right, I'll tell you a story that I think answers this question.
Okay.
Um, so I'll go back to my son again. When he turned 2, we were in our backyard. We too live in a neighborhood that we were so fortunate to get into to find a house in because he's surrounded by kids his own age and there are playgrounds and all the things you would think of when you think of a
Yeah.
neighborhood. So we're out back. My son is a summer baby, so it's a beautiful day, and we're having his second birthday party. His grandparents are there and his cousins, and we're just having a great time. And then I look over, and my son is just frozen. He looks terrified almost. And I said, Russ, what's wrong? And I realized it wasn't that something was wrong. It was that he heard the garbage truck coming up the alley behind our house. And at that time, for a 2-year-old, seeing the garbage truck was like the absolute most exciting thing that could happen in our house. And so the garbage truck comes up, and there are a few garbage men working, and they see that there is a 2-year-old's birthday party going on, and that clearly the center of attention is totally focused on them. And I will never forget this. They start really laying it on thick because they know my son's interested. So they're sort of like juggling the garbage bags and they're trying to do tricks and like throw the garbage into the truck in all these fancy ways. And then, they got everything in the truck and they moved on. It was like this nice little moment. It was like, oh, I really am happy to be in this neighborhood. And then the next day, I heard the garbage truck rumbling outside, and I thought that's odd. They never come 2 days in a row. Maybe they forgot something. And then my doorbell rang. I thought, well, that's even stranger. If it's that garbage, maybe they need me. I have to move my car or something like that.
Yeah.
And I go downstairs, and on my porch are 6 very sweaty garbage men, and they have come because they have brought my son his own toy garbage truck. And to this day, this was over almost, yeah, over a year ago now. That garbage truck has never left my son's sight. And you all in your audience, you know young kids. For a toy to last more than 2 weeks as the favorite is really impressive. This has gone on for more than a year. And
Oh,
I think it's because, those six guys took the time again to be that best teacher in the world. They were loving what they were doing. Even it was picking up garbage, and they were loving it in front of my son. And so I guess that's a roundabout way of saying when we think about neighborhoods, we need to remember, Fred didn't create Mr. Rogers' classroom or Mr. Rogers' school. It was the neighborhood for a reason. And we need to remember all of these people down to the garbage man or the mailman, as Mr. McFeely was, or Audrey Roth, who ran the cleaning company in the neighborhood. All of these people have something to share with our kids. And the more we can expose kids to that and draw those people into the fabric of our children's lives, the better off they're going to be for it. Whether it's in finding a profession that speaks to them or a passion that they take up, or in my son's case, just a cool new toy that you never want to let go of.
Oh, what a great story. Thank you for sharing that.
Thanks for the question.
I love
I
it.
will never forget or never stop being grateful to those guys. And it was a lesson again of the power of a neighborhood.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Okay.
amazing.
So
Y-
amazing.
You've shared so many great tips and lessons from Mr. Rogers and aspects that went into your book. Is there any final thing you'd like to share with our listeners? Any last thought that you want to put out
No,
there?
I would just let folks know that, we have things on our website at whenyoowonder.org that, there are discussion guides and activities, and if you're interested, if you work at a school, Greg and I are always happy to Zoom with you and your staff or even come visit, reach out anytime. Um, there's so much that we can continue to learn from Fred. And the great thing for me and for Greg is that, as we've gotten out to talk about this book, which just turned 5 years old, it feels like it came out yesterday.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, People have begun to share with us, well, here's what I'm doing, right? Here's
Mhm.
my Fred-like thing in my classroom or my library, or just something I do at home.
Mhm.
And so our work has sort of morphed in a way from, yes, we talk about Fred and what he did in the neighborhood, but we've been able to curate all these examples from different schools and even hospitals and libraries, you name it, and then help reflect back all these Fred-like things that real people are doing today. Um, so
Okay.
hopefully it's all these little things that I mentioned earlier, these little things that add up to that atmosphere that all of our kids deserve.
Yes. And
Oh,
when will your next book be out?
That's a
Oh,
great question.
yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I have learned that it's much harder to write a new book when you're when you're a dad of two young kids,
oh,
and you get
Yes.
about 5 minutes to yourself a day.
Right.
So it's gonna be a while. I
Okay.
would say check back with me in 5 years.
We'll have you back,
oh,
but you just
oh,
let us
yeah.
know.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you for listening to Plant the Seed of Learning. We want to thank our guests, past and present, for sharing their knowledge and work. A special thank you to our producer, Penn Ketchum. You can find our podcast wherever you listen on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple. We can't wait to learn from you and plant more seeds of learning together.
All right. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you so much to both of you, not just for having me, but for everything you do.